In a small, close-knit town nestled in the heart of the Midwest, Pastor Carl was a figure of quiet authority and respect. A man in his early 50s, Carl had devoted his entire life to the service of God and his community. He had spent his youth in the solitude of a monastery, where he lived as a monk, dedicating himself to prayer, study, and contemplation. Those early years had shaped him into the person he was today, disciplined, humble, and deeply committed to his faith. Carl was born and raised in this town. He had been ordained as a minister in the very church he attended as a child, St. Mary's Parish, which had been a fixture of the community for over a century. For as long as anyone could remember, Carl had been a part of the fabric of this town. He had baptized its babies, married its couples, and presided over its funerals. To his congregation, he was not just a pastor. He was a guide, a moral compass, and a trusted confidant. Over the years, Pastor Carl had earned a reputation as a deeply compassionate and understanding man. He was known for his unwavering patience and his willingness to listen to anyone who needed counsel, regardless of the nature of their troubles. People in the town trusted him with their secrets, and he was often sought out for advice on matters both spiritual and personal. His sermons were filled with wisdom, compassion, and a deep understanding of human nature. However, beneath his calm and composed exterior, Carl carried a secret, a part of himself he had never shared with anyone. Jason, a young man of 22, was a recent college graduate who had returned to his hometown after finishing his studies in a nearby city. With his striking looks and easygoing charm, he was well known among the locals. Jason had always been friendly and polite, the kind of person who could strike up a conversation with anyone. His father, Mark, had raised him alone after his mother passed away when he was just a boy, and he had instilled in Jason a strong sense of discipline, honor, and integrity. Mark, in his late 40s, was a tough, no-nonsense man who had spent much of his life in the military. After retiring from active duty, he had returned to the town where he had grown up, determined to provide a stable life for his son. Mark was a traditionalist in every sense of the word, conservative in his views and strict in his expectations. He had been shaped by the values of his generation: hard work, loyalty, and a deep respect for authority. He often spoke about his military service with pride, and he had raised Jason with the same principles that had guided him through his years in the armed forces. Mark had struggled to cope with the loss of his wife, who had died unexpectedly when Jason was just 7 years old. Her death had left a void in their lives, one that Mark tried to fill by throwing himself into his role as both father and mother to Jason. He worked tirelessly to provide for his son, taking on odd jobs and doing whatever he could to ensure Jason had everything he needed. Despite the challenges, Mark had never wavered in his commitment to raising his son with the values he believed in. Jason had always been close to his father, but as he grew older, he began to realize that he was different from the other boys in his town. He felt an attraction that he did not fully understand, and over time, he came to recognize that he was gay. This realization filled him with a deep sense of fear and confusion. In their small town, being different could make life difficult, and Jason knew that his father, with his traditional views, would never accept who he truly was. Despite his growing awareness of his own identity, Jason kept his secret hidden. He knew that revealing the truth about himself would have serious consequences. He feared the judgment of his friends and neighbors, but most of all, he feared his father's reaction. Mark was a man of strong beliefs, and Jason had grown up hearing his father's opinions on what was right and wrong. He knew that coming out would likely mean losing the one person he loved most in the world. Jason felt increasingly isolated and alone, with no one to confide in about his true self. He began attending St. Mary's Parish more frequently, seeking solace in the quiet comfort of the church. He would sit in the back pew, his head bowed in thought, feeling the weight of his secret pressing down on him. It was during these moments of quiet reflection that he began to notice Pastor Carl more closely. Carl, always perceptive, had noticed the young man sitting alone at the back of the church. He could sense that Jason was troubled, that something was weighing heavily on his mind. Carl had seen many troubled souls in his time, and he had a gift for sensing when someone was in need of guidance. He would often catch Jason's eye from across the room, offering a small, encouraging smile. Over time, Carl began to feel a sense of compassion for the young man, sensing that he was struggling with something deep and personal. Jason found himself drawn to Pastor Carl's calm presence and reassuring manner. The pastor seemed to have a way of making people feel safe, like they could tell him anything without fear of judgment. For Jason, who had been carrying his secret for so long, this was a welcome relief. He began to entertain the thought of confiding in Pastor Carl, believing that if there was anyone in town who might understand, it would be him. Unbeknownst to Jason, Pastor Carl had been watching him closely for some time. He recognized the familiar signs of inner turmoil, having lived through them himself many years ago. Carl understood the conflict between who Jason was and who he felt he needed to be in a town like theirs, where tradition and conformity were the norms. And so, he waited, knowing that sooner or later, Jason would come to him for guidance. Jason had been grappling with his true feelings for as long as he could remember. Growing up in a small, traditional town, he had always sensed he was different, but he wasn't sure how to put it into words. Over the years, that vague sense of difference solidified into a clear understanding. Jason was gay. This realization came with a heavy weight. In a community like his, being gay wasn't just uncommon, it was something that most people would struggle to accept. He had lived with this secret for years, concealing it from everyone, including his father, Mark. Jason knew how his father felt about matters of tradition and morality. Raised with a strict code of conduct shaped by his years in the military, Mark was not the kind of man who tolerated deviation from the norms he held dear. Jason could not bear the thought of disappointing his father, or worse, being rejected by him. So he kept quiet, pretending to be like everyone else, hiding his true self behind a mask. The burden of carrying this secret alone began to wear Jason down. He felt increasingly isolated, trapped in a life that did not reflect who he truly was. He knew he needed to talk to someone, to share his feelings and fears, but he was afraid of judgment. He had seen what happened to others who dared to be different in their small town. Whispers behind their backs, ostracism, and sometimes outright hostility. The thought of facing that kind of reaction was terrifying. Yet the need to be understood, to be accepted for who he was, grew stronger with each passing day. Jason began attending church more often, sitting in the back pews, watching Pastor Carl as he delivered his sermons. There was something about Carl that made Jason feel at ease, a sense that the pastor would understand him in a way others might not. Carl's sermons were always filled with empathy and understanding. He spoke of love and compassion, of accepting others despite their flaws, and of finding the courage to be true to oneself. Jason found himself moved by these words, feeling as though they were meant for him. One Sunday, after yet another sermon that seemed to speak directly to his heart, Jason decided to stay behind after the service. He watched as the last of the parishioners filed out of the church, leaving him alone with Pastor Carl. As Carl began tidying up, Jason hesitated, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he took a deep breath and approached the pastor, his heart pounding in his chest. Carl looked up and smiled warmly when he saw Jason standing there, sensing that the young man had something important on his mind. Jason's hands were trembling, and he struggled to find the right words. After a few moments of awkward silence, he blurted out the truth. He was gay. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with years of secrecy and fear. Carl listened carefully, his expression calm and thoughtful. As Jason continued, he explained how he had felt this way for as long as he could remember, but had always been afraid to tell anyone, especially in a town like theirs. He spoke of his fears, his loneliness, and the constant pressure to hide who he truly was. Carl nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. After a moment, Carl began to speak. He shared with Jason that he had suspected as much for some time, and that he had been watching the young man with concern. He told Jason that he understood what he was going through more than Jason could ever know. Slowly, with a mixture of relief and disbelief, Jason listened as Carl admitted that he too had realized he was gay in his 20s. Carl spoke of his own struggle with his identity, growing up in a world that did not accept him for who he was. He explained how he had felt torn between his faith and his feelings, how he had chosen a life of celibacy and service to God as a way of coping with his inner conflict. It was a choice that had brought him peace, but not without its own kind of suffering. He told Jason that he had never shared this secret with anyone before, but he felt it was time to be honest, not just with Jason, but with himself. Jason was stunned. He had never expected Pastor Carl to say such a thing. For so long, he had felt alone in his struggle, but now, here was someone he had admired and respected, someone who understood exactly what he was going through. The weight of his secret suddenly felt a little lighter. For the first time in his life, Jason felt truly seen and accepted for who he was. They talked for a long time that day. Carl reassured Jason that there was nothing wrong with him, that he was not alone, and that God's love was unconditional. He encouraged Jason to be patient with himself, to take his time in figuring out how he wanted to live his life. He offered to be there for Jason, to listen whenever he needed to talk, and to help him find his way. As the days passed, Jason found himself drawn to the church more and more. He sought out Carl's company, feeling the deep sense of comfort and security in their conversations. They spoke of many things, their shared experiences, their fears, and their hopes for the future. With each meeting, Jason felt more and more at ease, less burdened by his secret. Carl became more than just a pastor to him. He became a confidant, a mentor, and perhaps something even more. The connection between them grew stronger, a bond formed from shared understanding and mutual respect. For Carl, Jason was a reminder of his own youth, of the struggles he had faced, and the choices he had made. For Jason, Carl was a source of wisdom and comfort, someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. As the weeks passed, Jason and Pastor Carl began to see more of each other. Their meetings at the church became more frequent, often lasting for hours as they talked about everything that had been weighing on Jason's heart. The young man found himself pouring out his soul to the older pastor, sharing not just his fears and uncertainties, but also his dreams and desires. For the first time, Jason felt truly understood and accepted for who he was, and it brought him a sense of peace he had never known before. Pastor Carl, in turn, found himself deeply drawn to Jason's openness and vulnerability. There was a sincerity and warmth in the young man that he had rarely encountered in his years of ministry. Jason's honesty about his struggles, his courage in confiding such a personal secret, stirred something within Carl that he hadn't felt in years. The conversations they shared were more than just exchanges of words. They were connections between two souls who had both struggled with their identities in different ways. As they continued to meet, the dynamic between them began to shift subtly. What had started as pastoral counseling grew into a deeper emotional bond. Carl found himself looking forward to their talks, his thoughts often drifting to Jason even when he wasn't around. He admired Jason's strength in confronting his truth and was moved by the young man's innocence and naivety. For Jason, Carl represented a safe harbor in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to his true self. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit church office, the conversation took a turn. They had been talking about the challenges of being true to oneself in a society that often demanded conformity. Carl shared more of his own experiences, revealing his struggles with loneliness and isolation. Jason listened intently, his gaze fixed on the older man, and he felt a growing sense of empathy and understanding. Carl shifted in his chair, his gaze never leaving Jason's face. He could feel his own heart beating faster, his hands trembling slightly. He wasn't sure what to say next, but he knew that something was about to change between them. Slowly, almost instinctively, he reached out and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but it carried a deeper significance, one that neither of them could ignore. Jason didn't pull away. Instead, he found himself leaning in closer, drawn to the warmth and compassion in Carl's eyes. The tension between them thickened, and Jason could feel a surge of emotion rising within him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. It was just the two of them, alone in the quiet of the church, both aware that they were crossing a line but unable to stop themselves. Then, almost without realizing it, they moved closer. Their shoulders touched, and Jason felt a shiver run down his spine. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening, yet he did nothing to stop it. Carl, too, felt the weight of the moment, his own conflicted feelings coming to the surface. They sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, and then, finally, Carl spoke. He suggested that they should meet somewhere outside of the church, where they could talk more freely without the constraints and pressures of their usual surroundings. Jason agreed without hesitation. The idea of meeting in secret was thrilling, and the thought of spending more time with Carl filled him with a sense of excitement and anticipation that he had never felt before. They agreed to meet at a secluded spot on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. It was a small, abandoned park that was rarely visited at night, hidden away by a cluster of tall trees. They chose a night later that week, when the moon was full and the darkness would offer them some measure of privacy. As the day of their meeting approached, Jason found it increasingly difficult to contain his emotions. He had never felt so alive, so free, yet so conflicted at the same time. On the night they had agreed to meet, Jason waited until his father had retired to his room. Mark, who often stayed up late reading or watching the news, finally switched off the living room light and went to bed around 10:30 p.m. Jason waited another half hour, listening carefully for any sounds coming from his father's room. Once he was sure Mark was asleep, he quietly got dressed and made his way to the front door. As he opened the door, Jason felt a rush of cold air hit his face. He stepped out into the night, his heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. He had almost closed the door behind him when he heard his father's voice. Mark had not yet fallen asleep. He had heard the sound of the door and was curious about where his son was going so late at night. Jason quickly turned around, startled, and realized he had been caught off guard. Thinking quickly, Jason mumbled that he was going on a date with a girl from town. Mark, still suspicious, asked if it wasn't too late for a date. Jason, eager to avoid further questions, simply nodded, saying it was a last-minute arrangement. Without waiting for a response, he closed the door firmly and hurried away, leaving his father standing there, frowning. Jason made his way to the park as quickly as he could, glancing back over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't being followed. He felt his heart thumping in his chest, both from the fear of being caught and the excitement of what was to come. When he arrived, he saw Carl standing near a bench, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. The older man's expression was a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. That night, under the cover of darkness, they gave in to the feelings that had been building between them. It was a moment of passion and relief, a release of all the tension they had been carrying. In each other's arms, they found solace and comfort, a brief escape from the burdens of their reality. For a short while, the rest of the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them together. But they both knew that what they were doing was dangerous. Their relationship had to remain a secret. If anyone in the town found out, it could ruin them both. Carl would be disgraced, possibly excommunicated from the church, and Jason would face not only the judgment of the townsfolk, but the wrath of his father. The fear of being discovered loomed over them like a dark cloud, but neither could deny the connection they felt. After that night, they began to meet regularly, always under the cover of darkness, always in places where they were unlikely to be seen. They would talk for hours, sharing their thoughts and dreams, but also their fears and insecurities. Each secret meeting deepened their bond, but also increased the risk of exposure. Despite the danger, they could not stay away from each other. For Jason, it was the first time he felt truly understood and accepted. For Carl, it was a chance to feel alive again, to connect with someone who understood the parts of himself he had kept hidden for so long. The relationship brought them both a sense of purpose, but it was also a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. That night, they both gave in to the feelings they had been denying for so long. It was a moment filled with a mixture of passion, guilt, and exhilaration. They had sex. They knew what they were doing was considered a sin by the standards of their faith and community, but in that moment, it felt like the only truth that mattered. There was no denying the depth of the connection they felt, the powerful attraction that had been simmering just beneath the surface for weeks. For Carl, It was a bittersweet moment. He had lived a life of denial for so long, pushing away his feelings, telling himself that his calling as a pastor meant he had to live without love. But here, with Jason, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in decades. It was intoxicating, but also terrifying. He knew that their actions were forbidden, that if anyone found out, it would mean the end of his life as he knew it. He could lose everything: his church, his reputation, his entire sense of purpose. Their relationship continued in secret. They met at night, at Carl's home, and had passionate nights with each other. Jason was particularly worried about his father. Mark was a traditional man, set in his ways, with a strict sense of morality. He had raised Jason alone after his wife's death, instilling in him a rigid set of values that left little room for deviation. Mark's discipline was a legacy of his time as a soldier, where rules and order were everything. He was proud, stubborn, and fiercely protective of his son. Jason knew that if his father ever found out about his relationship with Carl, there would be consequences, serious ones. Mark, Jason's father, had always been observant, though he maintained a calm exterior. His military background had honed his attention to detail and his ability to notice the slightest changes in his environment. Though he had trusted Jason, recent behavior had started to raise his suspicions. It began with subtle signs. Jason had been leaving the house more frequently at odd hours, his demeanor had become more evasive, and his phone had started to disappear for long stretches of time. Mark had initially dismissed these as typical teenage behavior, but the consistency of Jason's late-night absences began to gnaw at him. He noticed that Jason seemed more withdrawn and less communicative, often lost in his own thoughts. The changes were gradual but significant enough for Mark to take note. One evening, Mark was up later than usual. He had been working on some paperwork and decided to take a break to watch the news. As he sat in the living room, he heard the familiar creak of the front door. It was a sound he knew well: Jason leaving the house. Mark glanced at the clock. It was nearly 11 p.m. He found it odd that Jason was going out at such a late hour, especially when he had not mentioned any plans. His curiosity was piqued. Mark decided to investigate. He quietly got up and followed Jason's tracks, moving carefully to avoid making any noise. He watched as Jason hurried down the street, his posture tense, clearly trying to avoid being seen. Mark kept a safe distance, trailing his son through the dimly lit streets. He followed Jason to the edge of town, where a small abandoned park lay hidden by trees. This park was not a place Jason would typically visit. It was secluded and far from the familiar spots Jason usually frequented. Mark hid behind a cluster of trees, keeping his eyes trained on the park's entrance. After a few minutes of waiting, he saw Jason's figure appear in the distance, and shortly after, Pastor Carl's silhouette emerged from the shadows. The two figures met near a park bench, their interaction initially appearing casual. Mark's heart pounded as he watched, his mind racing with questions. He knew something was happening, but he needed more information to understand what exactly it was. After waiting a little, Mark saw his son and the shepherd kissing on the lips. Their kiss was passionate and very long. The revelation was a devastating blow to Mark. His suspicions were now confirmed. Jason and Pastor Carl were involved in a relationship that went against everything Mark believed in. The betrayal felt personal and profound. Not only was his son involved with someone he considered morally unacceptable, but it was also a trusted figure in their community, a pastor who had been a symbol of moral authority. The weight of this discovery was almost too much to bear. Mark felt a surge of anger and betrayal. His mind raced with thoughts of how to confront the situation. He knew he had to address this directly, but he also knew that it needed to be handled carefully. His instincts told him that confronting Jason immediately would only lead to more confusion and conflict. Instead, he decided to confront Pastor Carl first, hoping to get answers and to make sure the pastor knew that he was aware of what was going on. The next day, Mark struggled to keep his composure. He was still processing the shock of what he had witnessed and was grappling with a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. He decided to wait until after church services, when Carl would be alone. The pastor was known for staying after the services to handle administrative tasks, and Mark knew this would be a good time to talk. Arriving at the church, Mark's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He was determined to have a straightforward conversation with Carl, but he also felt a gnawing apprehension about how the encounter would unfold. He walked into the empty church, his footsteps echoing in the vast, quiet space. Carl was at his desk, going through some paperwork, and looked up as Mark entered. Mark's demeanor was cold and stern. He had made up his mind to be direct and uncompromising. He told Carl that he had seen Jason and him together, and that he knew about their relationship. The confrontation was intense and charged with emotion. Carl was initially taken aback, his expression a mix of surprise and guilt. He tried to explain, to justify his actions, but Mark was having none of it. The betrayal felt too deep, the violation of trust too profound. In the heat of the moment, emotions escalated. Mark, driven by anger and a sense of betrayal, attacked Carl. The confrontation turned physical, with Mark's military training giving him an edge in the altercation. In the struggle, Mark struck Carl with a force that was more than intended. Carl fell to the ground, hitting his head on the podium. The impact was severe, and Carl lay motionless, his breathing shallow. Realizing what had happened, Mark was overcome with panic. He had not meant to cause serious harm, but the outcome was undeniable. He fled the scene, driven by a sense of dread and fear. He knew that he had crossed a line and that his actions would have severe consequences. He ran back home, trying to suppress the rising sense of guilt and horror that consumed him. The following morning, the church was abuzz with concern. Pastor Carl had not shown up for the morning service, and when his absence was noted, a search was organized. His body was discovered in the church, lifeless and cold. The police were called, and an investigation into his death began. The discovery of Carl's body set in motion a series of events that would unravel the hidden secrets and bring the truth to light. The discovery of Pastor Carl's body had set the stage for an intensive investigation led by Detective Iden. The detective, known for his meticulous approach, understood the gravity of the case. The death of a respected community leader under such mysterious circumstances demanded a thorough and sensitive examination. Detective Iden's first step was to secure the crime scene and gather evidence. The church was cordoned off to preserve any potential clues that could reveal what had transpired. The detective meticulously combed through the scene, taking photographs and collecting physical evidence. The area around the podium, where Carl had fallen, was carefully examined for any signs of struggle or additional clues. Despite the apparent violence of the confrontation, there were no signs of forced entry, indicating that the assailant was someone Carl knew. Iden's attention turned to the physical evidence found at the scene. The detective noted the presence of blood on the podium and nearby floor, indicating the severity of the head injury Carl had sustained. Forensic experts were brought in to analyze the blood spatter patterns, which could provide insights into the nature of the struggle. The detectives also collected fingerprints and other forensic evidence to identify anyone who had been in the church recently. One of the key pieces of evidence was the surveillance footage from a security camera near the church. Although the camera did not capture the inside of the church, it recorded footage of the area around the building. By reviewing this footage, Iden was able to confirm that Jason had been seen leaving the church just before Carl's body was discovered. This piece of evidence, while not directly implicating Jason in the crime, raised questions about his involvement and whereabouts during the critical time. The detective's investigation extended to interviewing those who had interacted with Carl in the days leading up to his death. Church members, staff, and friends were questioned about Carl's behavior, any recent conflicts, and his interactions with others. It became clear that Carl had been under considerable stress, though no one could pinpoint the exact cause. Mark's behavior and statements during his interrogation were scrutinized closely. His initial reluctance to discuss his actions and his inconsistent alibis drew suspicion. Detective Iden focused on the discrepancies in Mark's account, particularly his movements on the night of Carl's death. The forensic evidence collected at the scene, including blood and possible fingerprints, was analyzed to determine if Mark had been present at the church during the time of the incident. The detective also examined Mark's background, including his military service and personal history. Mark's military training, which included hand-to-hand combat, explained the intensity of the confrontation. Iden looked into Mark's past interactions with Carl and found that there had been some tension between them, though nothing that indicated a violent confrontation. Jason's interviews were equally telling. Although he was emotionally distressed and his statements were often fragmented, his descriptions of his interactions with Carl provided a clearer picture of their relationship. Detective Iden noted the strong emotional bond between them, which seemed to be a key factor in understanding the motivations behind the events. Jason's statements also revealed the growing conflict between his father and Carl, adding context to the investigation. As the investigation progressed, Detective Iden was able to piece together a timeline of events. The evidence suggested that Mark had confronted Carl at the church, driven by a mix of anger, betrayal, and a sense of moral outrage. The physical confrontation had escalated, leading to Carl's fatal injury. The breakthrough came when Iden cross-referenced all the evidence: the surveillance footage, forensic analysis, witness statements, and Mark's own admissions. It became clear that Mark had not only been present at the scene, but had been the primary aggressor in the altercation. The detective's findings were presented to the district attorney, leading to Mark's arrest and formal charges of manslaughter. The arrest of Mark rocked the community. The small town, which had always seen Carl as a pillar of morality and leadership, now faced the grim reality of a violent crime within its midst. The case garnered significant media attention, with news outlets covering every detail of the investigation and the ensuing legal proceedings. The emotional weight of the case was felt deeply by Jason. The revelation of his father's involvement in Carl's death and the public scrutiny that followed added immense pressure. He was left to navigate the complex emotions of grief, betrayal, and guilt, all while dealing with the consequences of the relationship he had shared with Carl. The trial of Mark, charged with the manslaughter of Pastor Carl, began several months after the investigation had concluded. The case drew considerable public attention, with both local and national media closely following the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with townspeople, journalists, and those who had known both Pastor Carl and Mark. The atmosphere was tense, charged with a mixture of curiosity, grief, and the desire for justice. The prosecution, led by an experienced district attorney, presented its case against Mark with compelling evidence gathered by Detective Iden. Key pieces of evidence were presented, including the forensic analysis from the crime scene. Blood spatter patterns and fingerprints found on the podium matched Mark's, confirming his presence during the altercation. Surveillance footage from outside the church placed Mark near the scene around the time of Carl's death. The prosecution also highlighted the inconsistencies in Mark's statements to the police, arguing that his evasive behavior was an attempt to cover up his crime. Witnesses were called to the stand to provide further context. Church members testified about the strained relationship between Mark and Pastor Carl, and some described the growing tension they had noticed in recent weeks. The medical examiner provided detailed testimony on the nature of Carl's injuries, explaining that the fatal blow to Carl's head was consistent with a forceful fall after being struck. This testimony reinforced the idea that the confrontation had been intense and violent. The defense, however, sought to portray Mark in a different light. Mark's lawyer argued that he had not intended to kill Carl, but had been provoked by the revelation of his son's secret relationship, which he viewed as a profound betrayal, not just by his son, but by a trusted community leader. The defense contended that Mark's actions were driven by a momentary loss of control, not premeditated malice. They described Mark as a devoted father who was trying to protect his son and his family's values, but who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of emotional turmoil. The defense also called on character witnesses who testified to Mark's history as a respectable member of the community, a dedicated father, and a disciplined ex-soldier. They emphasized that Mark had no history of violence or criminal behavior, and that his actions, while tragic, were not typical of his character. The defense aimed to show that Mark's actions were the result of an emotional breakdown rather than calculated intent. Jason's testimony was perhaps the most emotionally charged part of the trial. When called to the stand, he appeared visibly distressed, his voice wavering as he recounted his relationship with Carl and the night of his father's confrontation with the pastor. Jason described the secret meetings with Carl, their deepening relationship, and the night he realized his father had discovered the truth. His account provided insight into the emotional context of the events, but also demonstrated the immense strain he had been under. Jason's testimony was crucial in conveying the complexity of the situation. It showed the jury that the tragedy was not just about a single act of violence, but about a chain of emotional and personal conflicts that had escalated to a fatal breaking point. After several days of testimony and cross-examinations, both the prosecution and the defense presented their closing arguments. The prosecution reiterated that Mark's actions, though perhaps not premeditated, were reckless and had resulted in the death of an innocent man. The jury deliberated for several hours, weighing the evidence and testimony presented. When they returned, the courtroom was silent with anticipation. The foreman delivered the verdict, guilty of involuntary manslaughter. At the sentencing hearing, the judge took into account several factors, including Mark's lack of a criminal record, his service to the community, his military background, and the emotionally charged nature of the case. However, the judge also emphasized the seriousness of taking a life, regardless of the circumstances. After careful consideration, the judge sentenced Mark to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5 years for good behavior. Jason, who had been watching the proceedings with a heavy heart, was left to grapple with his own feelings of guilt, loss, and anger. His relationship with his father had been forever altered by the events that had unfolded. He mourned the loss of Pastor Carl, who had been both a mentor and a confidant, but he also struggled with the reality that his father had caused this tragedy. Jason was left to navigate a fractured life, torn between his love for his father and his grief for Carl.